is the bourbon?
It's just the cheap stuff.
Make mine a Woodford.
I'm not sure we have that.
Hey, friend, you want a Woodford?
Should whiskey be spelled with or without an E? Why did George Washington raise an army over distilled spirits? What's the U.S. official limit on whiskey's alcohol by volume? Keep watching for the answers and more. Welcome to the premiere of The Whiskey Cabinet, a channel dedicated to the history, craft, and enjoyment of the golden elixir. I'm your host, Jeff. In this video, I'll provide a brief introduction to whiskey and recount an oft-overlooked chapter from American history. If you're a whiskey expert, you may wish to rejoin the story after I've completed the first part. If you're a novice or you'd like a refresher, keep watching for the basics of Ishkabaha in Gaelic or Aqua Vitae in Latin, water of life. In English, the drink is called whiskey. Distillers invent and perfect mashes, signature combinations of grains and water that they ferment to produce whiskey. A mash should be proprietary. It should be a secret sauce. Barley, corn, rye, and wheat are the main ingredients. In the United States, the standards of identity for distilled spirits specify the following. Most drinkers prefer to mix rye to avoid the burn. Low-quality rye can entirely dissuade the uninitiated from whiskey.
Brian, I'm going to be honest with you, that smells like pure gasoline.
High-quality rye is bold yet nuanced. The word bourbon may not be used to describe any whiskey or whiskey-based spirits not distilled and aged in the U.S. Flavor is subjective, but for a general conception, bourbon is oaky caramel. Rye is dry, hot pepper. Malt whiskey is spiced toffee. And wheat whiskey is sweet vanilla. Malted barley and wheat are less familiar on the national stage, but the craft market has exploded in recent years. On this channel, craft will always trump distribution. Whiskeys must be aged for at least 2 years in new, charred, or toasted barrels of American oak. White oak predominates. Charring serves a primary purpose, preservation of barrel and contents. But it also serves secondary purposes, color and flavor. All specific varieties of American whiskey, bourbon, rye, etc., may not be distilled at more than 160 proof, but they may not be bottled at less than 40% alcohol by volume. Alcohol by volume is half the proof, or proof is twice the alcohol by volume. Coloring, flavoring, and blending materials are prohibited from bourbons and straight whiskeys. Other varieties allow them. Should whiskey be spelled with or without the letter E? Over time, the presence or absence of E created geographic associations. Whiskey without E includes Canada and the UK. Whiskey with E includes Ireland and the United States. Are there exceptions? Yes, some distillers opt for the alternative spelling despite their locations. The U.S. standards of identity for distilled spirits don't employ E, but note the word may be spelled either way. In subsequent videos, I'll cover types of whiskey, stages of whiskey production, more whiskey regulations, whiskey tastings and reviews. In short, all things whiskey. Subscribe to my channel so you won't miss them. I anticipate 1 video per month to start. Every journey begins with a single step. If you savor whiskey, if you are curious about whiskey, if you seek a forum to discuss whiskey, let's journey together.
You slip me a bottle of bourbon, a little glass, and some ice. You can do that, can't you, Lloyd? You're not too busy, are you?
With an introduction behind me, I'll relate an interesting, controversial chapter of American history that involved whiskey and presaged a rebellion. After the American War of Independence, the fledgling United States faced serious debts. So, like their enemies in Parliament, the nation's leaders levied taxes. The new government hoped a past grievance would become a quick fix. To be fair, its taxation came with representation. The Federalists, a political party committed to centralized power, sought taxes, mostly on luxury items to limit public outcries. Staunch Federalist and Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton proposed a tax on whiskey, and in 1791 his desire came to fruition. The first Congress and President enacted an excise whiskey tax that targeted distillers. An excise tax affects a narrow range of items, typically those deemed undesirable. The whiskey tax hurt tiny frontier distillers, who were cash-poor, small-batch producers. They often bartered their whiskey for other goods, yet the government accepted nothing but currency as payment. Large distillers weren't troubled. They could afford the flat fee and slightly increase their prices, so their sales volumes offset the tax. In an agrarian nation, where the president operated one of the largest distilleries with the assistance of unpaid labor, rural farmers didn't appreciate the levy. Many would neither register nor pay. Some drove off the government agents who visited them. Local militias were reconstituted. Demonstrations heralded violence. In Pennsylvania, an angry crowd trespassed on the estate of John Neville, tax collector and distiller. It surrounded his house and demanded the surrender of a federal marshal, David Lennox, who'd been working with Neville to enforce the tax. Earlier, a crowd confronted Lennox and Neville, but allowed them to pass. According to Alexander Hamilton, shots were fired at the duo. Neville truthfully informed the rabble that Lennox wasn't present, but as heated words flew, he shot a man. Neville said his victim tried to force entry. In other versions, Neville began firing from inside his home without regard for targets. Several in the mob blamed his jumpiness. From their perspective, government oppressor and whiskey purveyor Neville was the beneficiary of their sorrows. Let's pause to consider the man who pulled the trigger. Neville was a Virginia militia officer who joined British General Edward Braddock's ill-fated march to Fort Duquesne, the future site of Pittsburgh, in 1754. Along with fellow Virginian George Washington, he escaped the ambush that wrecked Braddock's army at the onset of the French and Indian War. Neville served the crown with the hope of eliminating obstacles to westward expansion. When the victor, Great Britain, set the Appalachian Mountains as the limit of colonial settlement, Neville and Washington were very upset. A few years later, both took up arms against their former allies. Neville commanded Virginia regiments in key battles throughout Washington's New Jersey campaign, including the battles of Trenton and Princeton. But after the war, with his land holdings sizably extended, he was elected to Pennsylvania's executive branch. His political career ended in less than a decade, and he became a tax collector. In 1794, he trekked the Pennsylvania countryside with Lennox, issuing court summonses to farmers who hadn't paid the whiskey tax. Draw your own conclusions about his motives and conduct. The crowd wanted vengeance for the shooting. When it returned the next day, Neville barricaded his house with help from his, unpaid laborers. Gunfire was exchanged. Soldiers arrived and shot 3 more trespassers. Neville slipped away. Eventually, the outnumbered troops surrendered, and the crowd burned Neville's estate. The incident stirred thousands of irate farmers who decided to march on Pittsburgh's federal collection office. President Washington sent the Attorney General, a state senator, and a state Supreme Court justice for peace talks. Simultaneously, he formed an army of almost 13,000 and sent it to Pittsburgh under the command of an old friend, compatriot, and war hero, Henry Lighthorse Lee. Ironically, one of Henry's sons was dispatched by the federal government with a similar charge 65 years later, when a fugitive from the frontier attempted an uprising. Henry's 6th son, Robert E. Lee, would bring the militant abolitionist John Brown to justice 200 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. President Washington announced he wouldn't let, quote, a small portion of the United States dictate to the whole Union, unquote. Because he traveled with the army before returning to the capital, technically, Washington is the only president to command soldiers while in office. Secretary Hamilton, who was anxious for a federal show of force, accompanied the expedition. The farmers, so-called rebels, dispersed prior to the army's arrival. Arrests and indictments followed. 2 men were convicted of treason and sentenced to be hanged. President Washington pardoned them. Hamilton was furious. I wonder what he'd say about his fictional portrayal in Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical. Anyway, by 1802, lawmakers had repealed the whiskey tax and all other internal taxes. A cynical man might study the Whiskey Rebellion, as it is known today, and see collusion by oligopolists in the government's actions. Whatever the case, the oft-overlooked chapter demonstrated whiskey's significance in American culture, and it foreshadowed a bloodier clash over unpaid labor and the extent of federal authority under the Constitution. I hope you enjoyed the premiere of The Whiskey Cabinet. Thank you for watching. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and post a comment. Engagement will drive recommendations, and recommendations will expand the community. Until we meet again, cheers.